it's very important to distinguish between the climate finance referred to under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the more generic usage of the term climate finance. No? Climate finance under the Climate Convention, I'm sure most of us are familiar, is very specific in terms of what it means. It means the finance to be delivered by the developed countries, care of their governments, because they have been accountable for the biggest part of the historical as well as continuing greenhouse gas emissions and have the bulk of responsibility for climate change. And this is for developing countries. So it's a transfer of resources from the rich industrialized countries of the north to the developing countries in the south. Under the UNFCCC, this is a legally binding obligation because it is a convention, no? And for us, it is more than just a legal obligation. As Mariel already mentioned, it is not aid, it is not assistance. We consider it actually reparations for the climate debt that is owed to the people of the South. But just to clarify, though, we're talking in this context about climate debt that is owed across countries. Just to emphasize one of Ratin's point, it's about the debt of elites and corporations, not the entire population and citizens of those rich countries. And there is also climate debt owed within countries, in all countries, even our countries in the South, as the elites and corporations, our domestic elites, are also accountable for their responsibility for climate change. So climate finance under the UNFCCC is supposed to cover the developed countries' fair share of their obligations towards mitigation, their compensation or reparations for the impacts, so that's for adaptation, as well as loss and damage in the South. Of course, loss and damage is a big issue because most of the developed countries, because that phrase is not mentioned in the convention that was crafted in 1992, are refusing to consider that loss and damage should be covered by climate finance. You know, in fact, the US in Paris in 2015 made it a condition for their agreeing to the Paris Agreement text. And so it's now in the decision text that compensation and liability for loss and damage should not be part of any discussion on climate finance. Well, going back, climate finance is supposed to be new and additional, mainly in the form of grants, although highly concessional loans are mentioned, and to be delivered as public finance by governments. It is also agreed in principle already at this point that it should be disbursed in a balanced way between mitigation and adaptation. I think one of the questions that was raised earlier is about that. No? Finance for loss and damage is something that we are still fighting for, and that's one of the major issues now being debated in the COP as far as how much finance is going to be ensured in the mechanisms for loss and damage. So that's climate finance under the convention. There is the more generic definition of climate finance. It refers to all finance, no matter the source, whether it's public and private, no matter the channels, even though it's through institutions not accountable to or within the framework of the Climate Convention, and all sorts of instruments. So grants, investments, equity, loans, bonds, and what have you. This distinction is important, not because we're saying climate finance should only come in the form of what is mentioned in the convention, but because one of the things we're fighting for is the delivery of this obligation. And if northern governments or developed country parties should not be allowed to count as part of the delivery of their obligations all these other climate finance flowing outside of the framework of the convention. There is one very important political reason for this, and this is because climate finance, its use, its purpose, how it is going to be used should be according to what the peoples of the South determines. It should not be subject to conditions and subject to preferred partners or preferred allied governments of developed country governments. So that's an important distinction, so that when climate finance is flowing through institutions like the World Bank, for example, that is controlled primarily by the developed country parties, we from the South have very little say in terms of how this is going to be managed, disbursed, and so on. So just in terms of performance, they have failed, of course, to fulfill that $100 billion pledge. That's already well known. This was promised in 2009, reiterated in 2015 in Paris. But actually, the failure to provide $100 billion is not even the biggest question, because $100 billion is just a small fraction of what is needed and what is obligated, no? And I think, Artie, you mentioned the 1 trillion. Is it 1 trillion just for one country? Actually, a study by the UNFCCC Secretariat themselves is referring to trillions with an S of dollars of climate finance that is supposed to be delivered. Now, if you look at the financial facilities under the UNFCCC, what is the actual track record, or what is the state of play? Pledges to the Green Climate Fund remain at a very low average of $10 billion every 3 years, even after 7 years of its full operation. So it's a little less than a little over 3 billion for all of developing countries for each year. But they're not even fully disbursing this $3 billion a year. If we consider the pledge for the Adaptation Fund, which preceded the GCF, only $1 billion worth has been mobilized throughout its 14 years of operations. Another issue is that climate finance are delivered mostly as loans, which contradict the principle and purpose of climate finance and only serve to exacerbate the already staggering debt burdens of developing countries. And by the way, that's my concern, Ratin, about bonds as an instrument for climate finance, because bonds, of course, are forms of liabilities. When governments float bonds, it's something that needs to be paid back. So maybe there's other arrangements that use bonds as instruments. The OECD data also shows that much of the climate finance mobilized by developed countries have been in the form of loans as high as 74%. In the year 2018, 74% of climate finance were mobilized in the form of loans. Let's look at comparing the priority they put on fossil fuel subsidies, a very important concern among energy transition campaigners. The G7 governments spent a combined total of $200 billion on fossil fuels just from January 2020 to March 2021, 15 months. But since 2001, the G7 countries have only mobilized $23.7 billion of climate finance. So now I go to the Philippines, what you've asked me to do. The Philippines is actually indicative of global trends. I didn't have much time to prepare something on content of the projects themselves, but just some of the statistics that's important to mention. No? Since 2007, 14 years, the Philippines has only received about $35.95 billion, $35 billion from various sources, including those under the UNFCCC finance facilities like the GCF, the GEF, and the Special Climate Change Fund, as well as other channels. So this is more generically climate finance of $35 billion in 14 years. 100 of these funds, I'm sorry, I'm not talking billion here. I'm talking million. Sorry about that, $1 million. Of these funds, 177.6 million was approved. Only 35 was disbursed. That's why I was talking about only receiving 35 million, or 20% of the amount. And 71% of the 177 million that was approved are in the form of loans. And the majority of what was approved are flowing outside of UNFCCC financial facilities. So 78%, mostly through the World Bank and through the ADB. Mitigation, approved projects for mitigation is 91.9% of the total funds. This is really indicative of the global trends because even in the GCF, over 60% of approved projects are for mitigation. Over 60% of the monetary equivalent. No, adaptation is only 14% for the 7.8% for the Philippines, and there's what they call multi-purpose projects. So covering both adaptation and mitigation is only 0.17%. So mitigation receives the overwhelming amount of climate finance, and the reason for this being is that, and they're quite, the providers of climate finance are quite blunt about this, is that there's no money to be made in adaptation. So mitigation, of course, in energy systems, there's cost recovery, so it's mostly going to mitigation projects. Of course, mitigation and the energy transition is hugely important. We know that 75% of greenhouse gases are coming from the energy sector, but adaptation, especially for the South, I mean, the longer we delay climate action, the worse the impacts are going to be. The Philippines, of course, is also part of other multi-country projects under the GCF, which were just recently approved. And these are funds of funds approach. So there are projects in the GCF which are actually funds. They're going to set up a financing facility that they're asking the GCF to fund. So it's a fund of funds. And this financing facility will be the one to take charge of approving projects. So there's no data available at the moment how much each country that are supposed to be beneficiaries of these funds are going to receive, because they still need to undergo that process of approval of projects in another layer. So it goes even much further in terms of transparency and accountability to environmental, social, and gender standards that we worked hard to establish in the GCF. The Philippines, I think one good thing that we can say about it is that it's also decided to mobilize domestic resources for climate programs. In 2012, the Philippine Congress created the People's Survival Fund, or PSF, and the fund receives approximately $25 million through budgetary allocation. So there is that climate funds appropriated from the national budget of the government. But it's another thing, of course, how projects are going to be designed, how they're going to be funded, whether stakeholders, especially communities and people's organizations and movements, are going to be involved in the design and implementation. And that's one of the biggest challenge to us. It's not just about talking a large-scale delivery of climate finance. It's also even more important to talk about how it's going to be used. And for us, we need to empower ourselves, not just to campaign so that there's more climate finance to be delivered. We need to really engage our government so that the funds are going to be used properly in projects and programs, whether mitigation, adaptation, loss, and damage, that needs to be mainstreamed and integrated into a whole system-wide approach to economic transformation in our countries, if they're going to be actually used properly, and what kind of projects should be given priority. Thank you.